Hi, okay, let's take a closer look at Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 1 to 9. This is the final chapter of the book, something of a change of pace, really, where Habakkuk responds, in fact, he responds in prayer to the Lord. Remember, what he now knows, the next big thing on the horizon for his people in the land of Israel is not liberation and peace and the safety and security and righteousness that he'd hoped for, but even worse, agonies in the form of a judgment against the wickedness of the wicked in Judah, coming in the form of the Babylonian or the Chaldean invasion. And here he reflects on that, speaking to God in prayer. It's clear from the very beginning that this prayer is supposed to be part of the ongoing reflection and prayer and song of Israel. This final chapter is set out very much like a psalm. It's the only place outside of the book of Psalms where you get the little refrain Selah. Nobody really knows what that means. Some kind of musical term, probably. It occurs 3 times here. In verse 1, according to Shigionoth, well, that's some kind of tune, probably, or musical setting. And then right at the end of the chapter 3, verse 19, there's another instruction to the choir master with stringed instruments, again, just saying how this is to be sung. And clearly, therefore, although written and composed and prayed initially by Habakkuk, it's supposed to be part of Israel's ongoing life and reflection and the people of God as we respond to God in prayer. Now, basically, what happens is that Habakkuk begins by saying that he's now heard what the Lord is going to do, and he stands in awe of the Lord. And from verses 3 down to, well, past verse 9, we'll get to verse 9 in this video, he recounts or anticipates, really, God's coming judgment using the language of God's previous judgments, particularly taken from the book of Exodus and the book of Judges. So let's just look through that for a moment. Verse 2, I've heard the report of you and your work, O Lord, do I fear. I stand in awe of your name, is how the New International Version translates part of that verse. It's interesting, just notice the resonance with the beginning of the book when Habakkuk started by interrupting before God could even speak and demanding to have an answer to his questions. Here, it's as if he's got to the point where, okay, now I've heard what the Lord is going to say, and my mouth is closed, at least insofar as coming up with further questions. I've heard of you, and I fear you, God. He pleads, second half of verse 2, that in the midst of the years, the Lord would remember mercy. There's a strange phrase here, in the midst of the years. It's not obvious what that might mean. It might be a reference to a particular time in Israel's history, like this particular time that Habakkuk's in. It might be a reference to the midst of the year, or one of the festivals that occurred during the year. But one way or another, Habakkuk is praying that as the Lord comes in judgment against the wicked in Judah in the form of the Chaldean army, which are going to invade, he would nonetheless remember to show mercy as he's promised to do. And then from verse 3 onwards, I mentioned echoes of Exodus, echoes of the book of Judges. Let me show you a few of those. First, verse 3, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Those are locations on the route of the Exodus. And you can see, if you remember some of the the things that Israel saw by which the Lord was manifested, lightning around Mount Sinai, the pillar of fire, and so on. You've got echoes of those in verse 3 and verse 4. His splendor covered the heavens, the earth was filled with his praise. Verse 4 especially, his brightness was like the light, rays flashed from his hand. Perhaps echoes of creation there as well, the rays of light coming from the Lord's hand. Verse 5, obviously another Exodus reference, a pestilence and a plague. Well, the plagues, the paradigm plagues, of course, were those on the Egyptians in the book of Exodus. Perhaps also he shook the nations, perhaps a reference to the earthquake at Mount Sinai, or perhaps the shakings of the heavens and the earth, the kind of thing that Haggai picks up in Haggai chapter 2. So you can see then various references to God's previous acts of judgment in the book of Exodus, by which he led his people out of slavery on a journey. Here, the boots on the other foot, so to speak, God is marching against the wicked in Judah with all that same might and power and ferocity. From verse 7 down to certainly verse 8, you have, I think, some echoes of the book of Judges. It's intriguing, this one. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. Verse 7. Cushan is mentioned in Judges chapter 3. Cushan Rishathaim. He is the pagan leader, warlord, king, who Othniel is raised up to defeat. And there's another good reason to see a link there, because Cushan Rishathaim is king of Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia means the land between the two rivers, or Aram of the two rivers, and you have a reference, the two rivers in verse 8. It's not so obvious that there's a link there in the English translation, but believe it or not, when you see Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, in Hebrew, and then you compare it with Cushan and against the rivers here in verses 7 and 8 in Hebrew, you notice the resonance very clearly. So that's definitely picking up the book of Judges, which makes sense then of the second half of verse 7, and this really does make you, well, this would make you tremble if you were in Habakkuk's shoes when you realise exactly what he's anticipating. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. You remember back in Judges chapter 6, the Midianites were the terrible and fearsome pagan enemies who were raised up against the people of Judah in the days of Gideon. And you remember at that point that the Israelites were reduced to such a state of desolation and fear and anguish that they were reduced to hiding in the caves and in holes in the ground and up in the mountains. Gideon was threshing grain, and he was having to hide in a wine press to do it because he was so terrified of these Midianites who never built any culture. They lived in tents, hence the curtains of the land of Midian. They just came through, stole what they wanted, killed people they didn't like, destroyed everything they didn't want, and then moved on. They were the most terrible and feared foes of that time. And again here, what's so significant and what's so frightening is that Habakkuk is seeing in this visionary prayer the Lord's approaching judgment by means of the Babylonian army in terms like this. This is how fearsome it is going to be. Such is the horror of the judgment of the Lord coming against the wickedness of the land of Judah. So that's the first half of Habakkuk chapter 3. Just a couple of little things. First up, there is a glint of light at the end of this chapter, so come back next time for the final video in this series. And secondly, I think we'll have a look at the book of Judges next in this series of videos. It's a fantastic book, and it's certainly understudied. It's not studied as much as it should be, and it could be, and there's a whole bunch of riches in it. So if those things in verse 7 have whet your appetite a little bit, then we'll come to that in due course. Okay, we'll leave any comments and questions below. God bless. See you next time.